Catawba 101 program and the drumming and dancing, which will be kind of the second part of it. But today I'm thrilled and excited to introduce Kathleen Hayes. She's a cultural public programs coordinator at the Catawba Center with the Catawba Nation. So thank you for coming again, and we'll come back up here in a little bit to kind of transition you out to the drumming and dancing area. But thank you for coming this morning. Kathleen?
Good morning. My name is Kathleen Hayes. I'm a citizen of the Catawba Nation, which is in Oklahoma, and I coordinate the public programs for the Catawba Cultural Center. So that means I get to coordinate field trips, do events like this, and I just love the opportunities that I have to share my culture and Catawba culture. So thank you all for coming out today. Before I get started, I wanted to begin with a land acknowledgement. So I want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Catawba Nation. We have stewarded this land for more than 6,000 years. In that time, Catawbas and other indigenous communities learned to live with the land in a good way, cultivating it into an abundant landscape that provided for all their needs. Today, we appreciate that this land provides food, beauty, and recreation for us, and understand that we owe much to the land. In 1763, much of the land was ceded to the British Crown through the Treaty of Augusta, and the remaining land was illegally ceded to the state of South Carolina in 1840 through the Treaty of Nation Port. Recognizing, acknowledging, and honoring the history of the land and Catawba Nation is only the first step. We must support and listen to indigenous voices while continuing to address the policies and practices that prevent us from being good stewards of the land and good neighbors with Catawba Nation. So I'm going to get started and tell you just a little bit about the Catawba Cultural Center. So this is where I get to work. In this building, which has a lot of history in and of itself. It's the building where Catawbas went to school before they were allowed to go to public school. And it was down the road, and then I'll talk a little bit about this later. In the about 30 years ago, it was moved down the road and became the Cultural Center. So we have a museum that's free, self-guided tours. We also have a trading post where you can buy art and souvenirs. We have a walking trail that goes to the Catawba River. It's about a mile long. And of course, we also offer public programs. So I encourage you all to come and check us out. We're located in Rock Hill, which is about 30 or 40 minutes south of here. So my job today is to give you about 6,000 years of Catawba history in about 30 minutes. So I'm going to be going very fast today, so let me know if y'all have any questions, and I'll also be taking questions at the end. But I don't know about y'all, but for me, 6,000 years is a hard time for me to wrap my mind around. But when I think of something that's really old, I think of the Declaration of Independence, but that is not even 250 years old. Something that's older than that is the Colosseum, which is almost 2,000 years old. Something that's older than that are the pyramids, which were built about 4,500 years ago. Something that's older than that is Catawba culture. So archaeologists have found sites and artifacts that are between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. So Catawba history begins with the Catawba creation story, and I don't have time to tell that story today, but it's a beautiful story about a red butterfly, first woman, and a sky man. So before the 1500s, we don't know much about Catawbas, but we do know that they were trying new things. Some worked, most probably didn't. Like most cultures, they're constantly changing. Catawba was a woodland tribe that lived in large cities with palisades and in bark houses, and their clothing was mostly made of buckskin. And Catawbas were well traveled. They traveled in dugout canoes up and down the rivers, up and down the East Coast. We know they traveled as far north as at least New York, and they would also frequently travel to the coast and to the mountains, trading many things as well as cultures. So like I said, we don't know much about Catawbas before 1500, but an important thing to remember is that culture isn't static. It was constantly changing. But things changed dramatically for Catawbas in 1540 with the arrival of Hernando de Soto and other Spanish explorers. They landed in Florida, and they were looking for gold. And they traveled north, going from tribe to tribe, looking for this gold until they reached what we believe is Camden, South Carolina. This picture on the left kind of depicts this. They arrived on the other side of the river of the large Catawba village called Cafetacheque. And the village sent out scouts to see who these new people were, what they wanted, and DeSoto requested to speak to the leader. So the scouts left, and then a little while later, a tall Catawba woman was rowed across the river. And the explorers must have been shocked to see that Catawba's had a woman leader, because where they came from, it was very uncommon for women to have leadership roles. So the Lady of Catawba speaks to DeSoto and asks what they want. He says that they are looking for gold, and she says she doesn't know what that is, they don't have any of that, but they were all welcome to stay. So the explorers stayed for 1 moon, or 1 month, but they were not such great guests. Does anybody have any ideas why maybe they weren't such great guests for the Catawbas?
Disease.
Yes. They were bringing in diseases. They also were not helping out with the cooking and cleaning and growing of food that they were eating. And one other problem was they would not leave the Catawba women alone. One thing that's common for most native tribes, including Catawbas, was that all people, including women, are sovereign, meaning they have control over their own bodies. And again, that was a difference that the explorers were not used to. That was not their culture. So that was a big problem. So the Lady of Catawba asks the explorers to leave. But when she does that, DeSoto lowers his weapon and points it at her and says they will not leave until they get gold. And so she says, oh, you're right, we have this gold, we've just been hiding it this whole time. So being the smart Catawba woman that she was, she led the explorers up to the Appalachian Mountains. Do y'all know any nicknames for the Appalachian Mountains? Any nicknames? You know, the Great Smoky Mountains. Y'all know that nickname? So Catawbas knew that it could get very foggy in the Appalachian Mountains. So once the explorers and the lady were up in the mountains, she got up early one morning when it was really foggy, and she hopped up and ran away, and they couldn't follow her because the fog was so thick. And she was able to return safely home with, I'm sure, some wild stories. So then after that, the DeSoto and the other explorers just kind of zigzagged all over the southeast. And so this green, I'll come over here. This is generally where the Catawbas were during this time when the explorers arrived. And then they zigzagged all over the southeast and eventually came to this yellow section, which is where my tribe was around this time. And so they also got to meet my people as well. So right after DeSoto's visit, the city and other cities in the southeast began to break apart into what we call confederacies, which were groups of villages that were connected through families, diplomacy, cultures, and we're not exactly sure why they decided to change the structure of their villages, but one likely explanation that was because of these new diseases that were spreading. Catawbas knew that one way to slow the spread was to spread out into smaller groups. So by the 1700s, Catawbas and other tribes in the southeast were organized into these confederacies, and all throughout the Piedmont area were these Catawba villages. So this is the Catawba deerskin map, which was made in 1721, that Catawbas made, and it was a gift to the British Crown. They were trying to make an argument for why the British Crown should be trading with Catawba villages, because it showed that they were in such a great location. This map is not to scale, but you can see on the left side, see the straight lines and the right angles. This is Charlestown, or Charleston. And then on the right, in the bottom box, like that box, is Virginia. And then in the top right are some other tribes, Cherokees and Chickasaw. And then all the circles in the middle are various Catawba villages. So you can see how they're just in the perfect location for trading, right in the middle. It's a perfect spot. So this also kind of gives you kind of an idea of how Catawba villages were set up in the 1700s. So the 1700s was a time of immense change for Catawbas. They were now a confederacy, which had its benefits, but the downside was that it took more land. And settlers were really moving in during this time. Some were invited by Catawbas to establish homes. Some were not invited. Some paid rents, but then stopped paying rent. And Catawbas knew that they couldn't fight back, because if they did, the colonial government would fight back, and that would not end well for Catawba. So they were kind of stuck in this place. But during this time, one leader really stands out for Catawba Nation, and that was Nopkahay, or King Hagler, which was a nickname he was given by the colonists because he was a great negotiator, or haggler. Y'all might have heard of, I think there's a lake, Hagler, there's some roads with Hagler in it. So he was the epitome of a great Catawba chief, being that he was both a diplomat and a warrior. He wasn't like a king in that he made all the decisions. Instead, he spoke for the people. We have several written records of him ending a speech and turning around and looking to the other Catawba warriors and chiefs and asking if he represented them correctly. And I cannot imagine the King of England saying something like that. So during this time, King Hagler really helps to guide Catawba through some difficult times. And today, one way his leadership is honored is through pottery. So you can see in this piece of Catawba pottery, you see the depiction of the man on each side of the vase. This is a depiction of King Hagler. We have several other examples at the museum if you ever come by, and you can see, and he is the only person that Catawbas traditionally depict in Catawba pottery. So as you can see, by the 1700s, the Catawba already have a complicated relationship with the colonists regarding land. During the Revolutionary War, Catawba sided with the colonists and hoped that their loyalty would be rewarded by the 1763 Treaty of Augusta being honored. An interesting fact is that Catawbas were the only tribe to side with the colonists from the beginning until the end of the war. And after the war ended, Catawbas were hoping that their loyalty would be rewarded with protection and the colonists honoring their promises to Catawba Nation. Unfortunately, this was not the case, and the situation gets so bad that the Catawbas go to Washington's home, Mount Vernon in Virginia. There's some seats right here if you want to come with me. So at the advice of a friend of Catawba Nation, they decide to put all of their land in the name of a person or people on a land title in order to conform with colonist land laws. We don't know what was said during this meeting when they all came together, but we know that it ended with the people of Catawba Nation deciding to put all of their land in the name of Sally New River and other Catawba women, which again is just phenomenal because during that time it was very uncommon for women to own land. But this was Catawba's way of saying, no, we're going to honor our tradition of being matrilineal and women being in charge of the land. Back in the day, if you wanted to build a house with your partner, you would have to ask one of your moms if that was okay. So this was how Catawbas continued that tradition. And so Sally New River protected the land until she passed away in 1821. You can see in this map, I know it's really small, that there's Charlotte up here. We're about right here. And this square is the reservation at that time. It is kind of interesting when North Carolina and South Carolina decided to split. North Carolina was very happy to just make the state line go around the reservation because they didn't want to have anything to do with Catawbas. So now if you look at the state line, you can still see this funky right angle in the state line, so that's where that comes from. And so you can still see that where Carowinds is, you can still see the state line. And then down in the square at the bottom right is where how small the land is after that time. So shortly after Sally New River's death, South Carolina approached Catawba Nation and asked them to sign a treaty for South Carolina to pay them and send them to live with the Cherokees, which was a pretty wild idea because at that point Catawbas and Cherokees had already been fighting for a couple hundred years at that point. In 1840, South Carolina signed an illegal treaty with Catawba Nation, and it was illegal because the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809 plainly says that the federal government, only the federal government, can make treaties with tribes and other nations. So South Carolina can't make a treaty with France, it can't make a treaty with Canada, and it can't make a treaty with Catawba Nation. Despite that, South Carolina made the treaty anyways, and they also never made the payments to Catawba Nation. After a few years, the Catawbas that had moved to live with the Cherokees returned home, to rejoin the Catawbas that had stayed. Unfortunately, they didn't have any land at this point, and they were literally landless in their own land. About 5 years later, a friend of Catawba Nation purchased about 600 acres, which is the area in this red box. And this is what we now call the old reservation, which is where the Catawba Cultural Center is. So you can see they went from the big square to now this, just a fraction of the land. Now the 1800s is a period of time where we don't hear much about Catawbas. If we learn anything about Native Americans in the 1800s in school, it's usually about the Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which was signed by President Andrew Jackson. During this time, the federal and state government left Catawbas alone for the most part because they were sure that they would die out. Of course, Catawbas are stronger than that. But while the Catawbas were spared from being forcibly removed to Indian Territory or Oklahoma, my tribe, Caddo Nation, was not. During the early 1800s, Caddos lived in the area that is now East Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. You can see in this picture on the left, this green shaded area is my people's ancestral home. And by 1835, they had lived there for about 1,000 years. And so in 1835, a treaty was signed between the U.S. and the chiefs, headmen, and warriors of Caddo Nation, where the Caddo were forced to cede all of their territory and move at their own expense to Mexico, which is an area now we call Texas. So not only were Caddos removed from their homeland of almost 1,000 years, they were removed from the United States entirely. The U.S.'s attitude seemed to be, I don't care where you go, but you just can't stay here. So the Caddo gave up 1 million acres of land in exchange for modest payments, only some of which were ever made. The next year, in 1836, Anglo-Americans declared independence from Mexico and established the Republic of Texas. And the name Texas, or Tejas, comes from the Caddo word Tesha, which means friend. Caddo stayed in Texas until they received threats from hostile settlers, which forced them to flee to Indian Territory, where they were given land to share with the Wichita. And so this map on the right is Oklahoma without the panhandle. And then this area in the red circle is the land that they shared with the Wichita. And they had this reservation until 1901 when the allotment period began, and the U.S. government broke up the reservation and made it into individual allotments. And each family was given an allotment, and then the remainder of the land was auctioned off to settlers. Another thing we hear about from the 1800s that has recently become controversial is Indian boarding schools. The policy of the U.S. government at this time was to kill the Indian to save the man. With or without the permission of their parents, Native children would be sent to these schools. When they arrived, they would be stripped of their clothes. If they were gendered as a boy, their hair would be cut, which for many tribes was only done in times of serious mourning. And if they spoke their language or practiced their culture, they would be beaten. This is a picture from Carlisle Indian Boarding School, which was the prototype for all boarding schools. Several Catawbas went, they attended there, and one Catawba child died while attending Carlisle. His name was Wade Ayers, and at this time he has not been returned to the Catawba community. Since we're talking about the 1800s and we're here at President Polk's site, I wanted to talk briefly about President Polk and how his presidency impacted Indian country. So Polk was president from 1845 to 1849, and during his presidency he increased the size of the U.S. by 2/3, which increased the U.S.'s jurisdiction over hundreds of thousands of Native Americans. He was a firm supporter of Andrew Jackson and urged Congress to adopt his policies, including Indian removal, and called Jackson the most eminent citizen of our country. During his term, he also wrestled with the beginning of the California Gold Rush, the Mormon settlements in Utah, and the destruction of buffalo herds on the plains. Also during his presidency, the Smithsonian Institute was established, which was charged with preserving artifacts from each tribal nation before they disappeared. President Polk oversaw 10 treaties with tribal nations, 7 of which negotiated acquisition of native land. And these tribes that are listed had some of their land acquired by the U.S. during Polk's presidency. In the 18 and 1900s, Catawbas were largely kept out of the economy, so they had to get creative in how to earn money to provide for their families, since they could no longer had enough land to hunt and provide for their families. One creative solution for one Catawba family was to create a ferry across the Catawba River because there were no bridges nearby. And we still have part of the pulley system at the Cultural Center, which I think is really cool. So y'all should check it out if y'all come by. So before I get into the 1900s, I want to spend a minute just talking about federal recognition, what it is, and why it's so important. So federal recognition is the government-to-government relationship between tribes and the U.S. government. Currently, there is a lengthy and arduous process for Native American tribes to gain their federal recognition status. Federal recognition is what distinguishes someone being a tribal citizen from someone with a Cherokee princess in their ancestry. It's not just about genetically being Native American, it's about citizenship and the benefits that come with that. Federal recognition allows tribes to negotiate and have treaties with the U.S. government, negotiating benefits such as educational rights, healthcare rights, being able to put land in trust, tribes having the ability to write their own laws, etc. So the 1900s was a huge period of change for Catawba Nation. In 1924, the first people of this land finally became citizens of the U.S. government. Does anybody have any guesses why this did not happen until 1924? What was going on during that time?
Depression? That and they did it?
It's close. It's kind of close to that time.
Industrialization?
No, that's a good guess.
Voting.
Well, nationalism was becoming more of a thing in Europe and in the United States as well. Did it have something to do with that and statehood?
It could have. That's not what I'm thinking of,
Okay.
but it could have. There's a big war that was going on. Yes, that's it. So Native Americans have a high rate of military, serving in the military. And so a large portion of Native Americans served during the war. And so kind of as like a thank you for that, Native Americans across the board became citizens in 1924. Some tribes fought for citizenship, like the Catawbas, others didn't, but that was something that Catawbas were happy for and fought for. And Native Americans have the highest rate of military service of any ethnicity even today. Since 9/11, nearly 19% of Native Americans have served in the armed forces, compared to an average of 14% of all other ethnicities. So then in the 1930s, the U.S. government created this new policy to establish the federal recognition process. So in 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act was passed, and that's what established the process. And Catawba Nation followed that process and gained their recognition status in the 1940s and established their own constitution, which is still followed today. But unfortunately, the U.S. changed its policies to be that of termination. And termination means that the U.S. government would come into a Native community and decide that they were assimilated enough, and then they would sever that relationship with the tribe, ending all of those benefits that I mentioned earlier. And so that's what they did with Catawba Nation. They came in 1959 and terminated the relationship with the tribe, which was devastating for Catawba Nation. And in the 1970s, the U.S. government changed its policy again and allowed for a way for tribes who had been terminated to regain their federal recognition status. And so Catawbas began fighting hard for that. And in 1989, the Catawba Cultural Preservation Project was established, which is now the Catawba Cultural Center. And its purpose was to preserve and celebrate Catawba pottery. Because one thing that tribes have to do when they want to try to get their federal recognition status is to prove that they have a history that started before colonists arrived. And since Catawbas have a 6,000-year unbroken tradition of creating pottery, that was very instrumental in them getting their recognition status back. So we are a proud part of that history at the Cultural Center. And finally, in 1993, the Catawba Settlement Act was passed, and that was what gave Catawba Nation its federal recognition status back. And Chief Harris says that we are currently in a Catawba Renaissance, since 1993. It's a very exciting time to work for the tribe. Even especially just during the last couple of years, we've had a tremendous amount of growth. So like any government, it's very complicated, but I just want to give you a simple explanation of how the government works. At the very top, we have General Council, and that's made up of every Catawba citizen that is 18 years or older. And so they come together twice a year, just like they did in the 1800s when they put all their land in the name of Sally New River. Now they meet in January and July to come together to vote on things that are important to Catawbas. And in July, they're going to be voting for all their elected officials. So these are currently our elected officials. Since the General Council only meets twice a year, they elect elected officials to run the day-to-day government. So we have our chief, Chief Harris, an assistant chief, secretary, treasurer, and 2 at-large members. You'll notice that all of these are men, even though we are a matrilineal society. So even though all the elected officials are currently men, most of the directors and leadership roles in the government are actually women. And this summer, at least some of these faces will change. It'll be interesting to see who wins the election. Our chief has decided to not run for re-election, so we will be getting a new chief this summer.
I got a quick question. Are
Yes.
the 2 Harris, are they brothers?
They are not. One thing with tribes is we often have a lot of last names that are very common, and Harris is a very common name. They're not related.
There's 2 Becks up there too.
Okay, yeah, the 2 Becks are brothers.
Oh, okay.
Yes, they are related. Yeah, good question. So under the executive committee, we have the tribal government, and these are all the departments currently of the tribal government. So I work for the cultural services. Some of these are brand new, because we've had so much growth over the last couple of years. There are other organizations as well. We have a new casino in North Carolina, if y'all are familiar with that. That's also under the government. So this is my contact information. Follow us on Facebook and social media if you're on there. That's where we post a lot of our updates. I'd love to see you guys at the Cultural Center. This is my email if you ever want to contact me and you think of a question later. But I'm also can hang around here for a little while. Does anybody have any questions about Catawba Nation or the Cultural Center?
Well, it's not about Catawba Nation, but around 1850, about how many Indian tribes were in the United States around 1850? I mean, how many are there? I don't know if you know the answer to that.
Okay, I don't know about in 1850, but I can tell you today there's almost 600 federally recognized tribes,
Wow.
as well as several state recognized tribes. So there's quite
And
a
the
few.
furthest east, would they be the furthest east in this country? Would they be the Catawba tribe, or are there some? I know there's in Oklahoma, South Dakota. There's a lot more out west, right?
Yes,
More
because
land.
yes, because of the Indian Removal Act, most of the tribes in the southeast were removed, including my tribe to Oklahoma. So there aren't many tribes that are still left here. Catawba Nation is the only federally recognized tribe in South Carolina. There are also 9 state recognized tribes. North Carolina has several. I think there's 10 state tribes, or 8.
4 urban Indian organizations.
Okay, thanks. So there's quite a few still in the southeast, but unfortunately most were moved to Oklahoma.
Ironically, when we were driving over here, we were listening to the radio, and there was actually a story on the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina about them fighting to get their federal recognition that they've never gotten because the federal government said they were ending all of that, and so they've been trying for years to get the kind of recognition that the Catawba have.
Yeah, Catawba were very lucky that they were able to get that back. Unfortunately, it's a very difficult and political process.
It was kind of interesting. Did you see where they had like on 60 Minutes or something where the Canada finally came out, Trudeau came out and apologized to the Indians for the boarding school? Was that, I think there was a Micmac Indians, or I don't know which ones were Canadian Indians, but that was kind of an interesting story. Where they did the same thing to them, tried to, assimilate them into the population, stripping away all their heritage and everything from them, and how it was so wrong.
Yes, yeah, Canada has a similar history with boarding schools. Theirs actually went through the 90s, so they continued that longer than the U.S. did. And fortunately, we have, for the first time, a Native American Secretary of the Interior. And this is why representation is so important in government. And for the first time, we have the U.S. government who is doing something. I'm not quite sure what she's doing, but she's doing something to try to make amends for that, and I think she's doing studies on that.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Rue, I'm the citizen of Catawba Nation, and I'll be helping out in a minute for the drumming and dancing. In 2001 to survivors of the boarding school system and listen to their stories. On top of that, this is the first time that we've actually gotten data on the number, for example, the number of schools that were actually funded by the federal government, the number of children that attended those schools, and importantly, the number of children that never made it home. And in Catawba Nation, we have one of those kids. I don't know if you talked about Wade Ayers, but yeah, so it's kind of a exciting and sad moment.
I found it interesting that Polk, the Smithsonian was established during Polk's presidency because the Native American History Museum in DC is incredible. But it also, because it's national, it doesn't get into some of the detail that you got with each tribe and how, I mean, there were many tribes, and this happened all over the place. It wasn't, you know, wasn't just here, and so just getting an overview from there was really cool. It was really cool to be able to go and see that.
Yeah, the Smithsonian museums are great, and we're very grateful that there's a Native American one. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
The government structure that you described,
Mm-hmm.
can you equate that with a small American town?
I think so. I think it's similar to like a
The way they approach their rules, regulations, laws?
Yes, like Catawba Nation recently established its own police force. They have the authority to do probably like a fire department and other things, but I think for the most part we partner with York County, the county that we're in, to provide a lot of services, but Catawba Nation has the authority and the capability to have things like a police force. We have our own doctor's offices, clinics. I don't know, Rudy, you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much any function that you'd see in a local government, you'll see inside of tribal governments. Like we have our environmental services division that watches our air and water quality, things like that. One of the interesting challenges of tribal governance is that it's not geographically limited. So, right, if you're a city, your constituents are the people that live within the boundaries of your city. We have about 3,800 citizens, about 1,000 of them live on our reservation. Another 1,000 live right off the reservation in kind of York County, Mecklenburg County area. And then we have the final 1,000, 1,500 living all over the place. Utah, Oklahoma, Germany. I have cousins who've lived in Germany their whole lives. And so it's also like, how do you provide services? Also, how are they able to participate in tribal government? Some tribal governments have established rules that you actually do have to live on the reservation to vote in them. Catawba Nation doesn't have those rules, so there's some like tricky aspects to it that make it a little bit different than local government too.
Any other questions?
I'm curious, what are some of the highlights to see at the Catawba Cultural Center, since that's where you're located?
Yeah, I love going to the trading post and shopping, getting to support the cultural center, but also Catawba artists and other artists. There we have some new exhibits. We got to partner with University of North Carolina, and they have a lot of things on display from different archaeological sites. So we have one about lots of pottery, beads, jewelry that were found. We also have a dwelling, like a kind of a scale model dwelling for Catawba's of a bark home. That's really interesting to see.
I think I've seen that on the PBS, the Trail of History. That was cool. Do y'all have a good selection of arrowheads and stuff like that?
Yes,
Oh,
we
yeah.
have some arrowheads. Yep.
A lot of those.
Yep. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Just one question, because I've been reading a lot of Louis L'Amour lately. They talk about the Indians with their, and what he talked about was their knowledge of all the herbs and things around, and that he really was very helpful in curing a lot, or just, helping a lot of illnesses. But they still have concentrated in that area, that there's still keep that alive, keep that growing. That's my question.
Yes, Rue is our plant expert.
Oh, that's what I was getting to, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of different medicines. One of the interesting things is nowadays, like if you go out into your yard or someplace that has been kind of left fallow, a lot of the things that you're going to find are actually not indigenous to here. A lot of these weeds are actually ones that came with settlers, but Catawba still kind of adopted a lot of those plants. Another issue is that a lot of our very traditional plants are actually prairie plants, because this area was predominantly what we'd call Piedmont savanna. So instead of these kind of thick, scraggly forests, you'd have big sort of open areas with big trees in between them. And so you have a lot of different types of plants that grow there than what you see nowadays. So some of our traditional plants, for example, the Schweinen sunflower, which is an endangered plant, you can't find it growing anywhere now except for along the sides of roads, because that's the only place that kind of mirrors those old savannas, because they get mowed down regularly. And we can't go harvest from there because of the amount of, you know, just smoke and stuff that lands right on those plants. So part of what we work on with our Natural Resources Center is kind of cultivating those plants and cultivating the landscape that comes with them. Part of the reason that we don't have those savannas is because we aren't able to do large-scale controlled burning, because Catawba's, like a lot of tribes, did that, and also because we don't have bison populations anymore. So these large animals are really, really crucial for keeping the growth kind of low to the ground.
We have time for one more question. Yes.
So as part of that, do you have like a seed bank or work?
Yeah, actually, we have a seed library. A lot of those are seeds that we've gotten from other communities or just from commercial seed providers, because some of our traditional plants, like our traditional beans, for example, we don't have those seeds. And so while we mourn that loss, we're also looking at how can we develop the next bean that's really useful for our community, because, you know, at some point there had to be a bean come into our community and we said, oh, that's great, and let's grow it over generations, and that's how it became Catawba. But we do have actually now 2 heritage seed varieties, and I was actually just at Davidson because we're partnering with Davidson College to do a grow out of our flour corn, which we were able to bring back to our community 2 years ago. And then I just got back earlier this week from New York, upstate New York, because at one of the tribal farms up there, they actually have what they call a seed sanctuary, and it's got hundreds of varieties of corn from tribes all over the country that this one guy in the 80s who was just really passionate about corn collected, and then when he passed away, he donated it back to the tribes. So they're kind of stewarding it, but we've got back this jar of about 100 kernels of sweet corn that's completely black, and the last time it was grown was 1988. So we're very excited, but we're also very scared about the you know, the very real possibility that it won't grow. But you know, we're very hopeful about it.
Wake Forest has a small Four Sisters garden.
Oh, cool!
That they're starting up.
Yeah.
Next year.
And I don't know if you talk about Four Sisters, but this is the idea of like growing multiple plants together. So, you know, you grow the corn, you grow the bean with it, the bean uses the corn, and then you also have squash that creates a ground cover to keep the ground moist. And we're doing a study with one of the professors at Davidson about what is the yield if we plant them all together, or what if we just plant corn here, the next year plant beans, next year plant squash, and see if we do it in succession, what the outcomes are for, because, you know, we want to be traditional, we want to see what the benefits are of that, but we also are trying to provide food for people, so making sure that it's actually providing at scale is really important as well. Thank you.
Thank you all for your questions, your thoughtful questions, and for listening. I appreciate y'all coming today.
Everybody give Kathleen a hand, please. Folks, I do want to say a few words before we transition outside to do the drumming and dancing portion. First off, just recently, we here at the President Polk site, we have a 501c3 nonprofit that supports the site in many ways. And at the last board meeting, they voted to make a donation to the Catawba Cultural Center. So I am very pleased to present the Catawba Cultural Center a donation of $500 to go towards educational programming or exhibits, whatever the Cultural Center needs. So we're very honored and glad we can do that.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Secondly, as well, if you want to learn more about the Catawba, we actually carry 2 books in our gift shop. I've got a shameless plug here. One is Becoming Catawba, Dr. Brooke Bauer. She used to be at the University of South Carolina at Lancaster, and she's now at the University of Tennessee. But we just started carrying her book, so check it out if you like.
And she's Catawba, the first Catawba to write about Catawba history.
That's right, that's right. And then we're carrying a book about Catawba pottery, Thomas
Bloomer.
Thank you, Ruth. And so we're carrying that as well. So if you're interested, come see us. All right, so folks, we're going to transition outside. We've got some hay bales set up if you'd like to have a seat and take the presentation in. You're more than